It took more than 3 years after the stock market crash of October 1929 for the economy to hit rock bottom. Industrial production, employment, investment, and farm prices declined precipitously. Meanwhile, most politicians, the heads of the Federal Reserve System, economists, and business leaders predicted that after a couple of tough years, the economy would inevitably recover. Downturns, they argued, were simply part of a natural business cycle in which periodic panics drove out speculators and lowered wages and the price of goods in preparation for renewed growth. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, shared the belief of bankers in Europe that the most important thing to do in any economic crisis was to maintain the gold standard that linked a nation's currency to its supply of gold and prevent inflation. When in 1930 and 31, President Hoover brought together business leaders to discuss ways to boost employment and stabilize tumbling prices, professional economists criticized this so-called misguided activism, which they said might delay recovery by undermining faith in the dollar's link to gold. In 1931, the heads of some of the biggest corporations, such as U.S. Steel, the Ford Motor Company, and the New York Stock Exchange, buoyed by a brief economic uptick, declared the worst of the Depression already over. In December, President Hoover assured Congress that the fundamentals of the economic system were sound and that only dislocations, shocks, and setbacks from abroad delayed recovery. Soon after this, the economy collapsed and the capitalist system, both at home and abroad, broke down almost completely. In 1929, President Hoover and the Republican Party took credit for 8 years of economic growth that produced what they called a new era. But by late 1932, Hoover's earlier prediction that poverty would soon be banished sounded absurd to most Americans. Gross annual domestic investment fell from $16 billion to $1 billion. Stocks lost almost 90% of their value, and a fifth of the nation's 25,000 banks failed. Residential and business construction, steel production, and automobile output fell by one half. At least 20% of workers, 12 million people, were unemployed. The overall economy shrank by 33%. About 40% of Americans still lived in rural areas, and a quarter of the workforce held jobs related to agriculture, such as farming, food processing, building farm implements, and so forth. By 1932, prices for grain, cotton, dairy, and livestock had fallen to half their 1926 level. On a single day in 1932, 1/4 of all the farmland in Mississippi was sold at auction. The U.S. didn't lack raw materials, labor, or even capital, but investment in commerce had completely stalled. Instead of taking advantage of bargains as economic theorists predicted, nervous investors and banks stopped putting money into consumer industries such as cars and electric appliances because of declining demand. As unsold inventories mounted and investment funds dried up, factories laid off more workers, further driving down demand. As the economy shrank at home, U.S. banks and investors stopped making foreign loans, and by 1933, international trade declined by 2/3 from its 1920s peak. In a futile effort to boost domestic sales by walling off imports, Congress, in 1930, adopted the Smoot-Hawley tariff that hiked duties on foreign goods. Most other countries enacted similar protectionist measures to shield home industry and agriculture from imports. These actions had the net effect of hurting just about everyone. As national income declined, Germany first reduced, then, under Hitler, simply stopped paying World War I reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France, in turn, stopped paying their war debts to the U.S. When British economist John Maynard Keynes was asked if anything in history resembled this array of economic calamities, he replied, "Yes, It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. The scope of what was being called the Great Depression revealed the stark reality of poverty in America. During the boom time of the 1920s, the poor had been characterized as people on society's margins, comprised mostly of immigrants, people of color, the elderly, and those living in rural backwaters. But by the winter of 1932-33, around 15 million mostly white, urban males, 25% of the workforce, were chronically unemployed. Business and local governments often fired married women workers to preserve jobs for male heads of households. Because the federal government kept few statistics, even 15 million was probably a low estimate of unemployment and did not count those working just a few hours per week or desperate farmers, sharecroppers, or tenants who worked outside the cash economy. Out of the total population of 126 million people, probably close to half of all Americans lived a hand-to-mouth existence. Conditions were so bad that crowds routinely gathered at municipal dumps to rummage through garbage for food. African Americans, who comprised about 10% of the population and lived mostly in the rural South, faced even worse conditions. As cotton prices fell, landowners threw many families off the small plots they tilled. In the North, blacks worked mainly in the lower rungs of industry or in service and domestic jobs. Factory owners replaced many blacks with downwardly mobile white workers, while struggling middle-class white families fired blacks who worked as cooks, cleaners, and nannies. About two-thirds of the black workforce in New York and Chicago, the centers of African American population in the North, had no jobs at all. With little or no aid from federal or state agencies, local governments and private charities were overwhelmed. By law, most state and city governments had to balance their budgets. When local property taxes declined, cities and states fired municipal workers and reduced already meager social service budgets. Private charities run by religious and voluntary groups like the Salvation Army and Red Cross were equipped to assist individual hardship cases or emergency victims of floods or fires, not millions of long-term unemployed workers and their families. By one estimate, private charities could help only 5% of those in need. Hoover rejected pleas that he spend federal funds to directly assist the unemployed. Decrying this as a raid upon the Treasury, the president insisted that the federal government had no obligation to the unemployed and that providing assistance would only create dependency, not jobs. In the summer of 1932, Hoover backed congressional passage of an emergency bill that provided some funds for local governments for construction projects, but no aid went directly to the unemployed. That June, around 45,000 people, including 17,000 unemployed World War I vets, trekked to Washington, D.C. White and black vets and their families camped together in fields and abandoned buildings they derisively called Hoovervilles. The vets demanded immediate payment of a $1,000 pension or bonus that Congress had approved in 1924 for distribution in 1945. Hoover pressured lawmakers to refuse early payment. As a consolation, Congress offered to give the bonus marchers of the so-called Bonus Expeditionary Force free bus and train tickets home. 6,000 people accepted the offer, and others left on their own. By late July, around 15,000 demonstrators remained in the Capitol. On July 28th, Hoover ordered police and the Army, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, to clear the city of so-called revolutionaries. Most Americans were appalled as tanks and cavalry rousted the protesters and burned their encampments, killing 2 veterans and a child.
Hoover asked General Douglas MacArthur to lead a force to aid the Washington, D.C. police to remove the bonus marchers from these buildings and drive them back to their Anacostia Flats in Washington, where they had this so-called encampment. MacArthur exceeded his orders very dramatically. Not only drove the marchers out of the buildings and back to Anacostia Flats, but then he put their camp to the torch. Now, for reasons that aren't altogether clear, Hoover never publicly took MacArthur to task for this, and Hoover took onto himself the responsibility for this action, which was politically pretty nearly fatal. I mean, there's probably no single event in 1932 that was better utilized to symbolize Hoover's alleged callousness and indifference to the plight of the unemployed than the fate of the bonus marchers.
By 1932, many Americans were dissatisfied with the federal government and ready for a change. President Hoover was widely disliked, but the violent repression of the bonus army finished him politically. That fall, a majority of voters would look to new leadership to take action where Hoover had fallen short.
By 1932, Roosevelt was recognized as the nation's most prominent liberal Democrat. Unlike the passive Hoover, he recognized the Depression as the greatest crisis since the Civil War. The unemployed were not slackers, as Hoover implied, but victims of complex and impersonal forces over which they had no control. He called on states and the federal government to create work relief programs, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions. In addition to Harry Hopkins, a social worker who had headed a New York State agency that hired the unemployed to work on public projects, and Eleanor, FDR relied for ideas on three academic lawyers and economists from Columbia University, Raymond Moley, Rexford Tugwell, and Adolph Burrell. They all advocated increased regulation of business and greater government economic planning to salvage capitalism. Journalists called them the Brain Trust. After Roosevelt secured the Democratic presidential nomination in the summer of 1932, he spoke of rebuilding the economy from the bottom up by helping the forgotten man. He pledged to use federal power to ensure a more equitable distribution of income and promised bold experimentation in pursuit of what he called a New Deal. On November 8, 1932, Roosevelt trounced Hoover, winning nearly 58% of the popular vote, or 22.8 million to 15.7 million. The challenger received 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59, winning all but 6 states. Democrats took control of the House by a margin of 310 to 117, and the Senate by 60 to 35. Roosevelt's landslide victory signaled hope, but no quick change. Nearly everything got worse between November 1932 and the inauguration in March 1933, including the weather. A drought that already afflicted the Upper South spread west into Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas, carving out what would soon be known as the Dust Bowl. Hoover, now a lame duck, spent the time from November through March calling on the president-elect to endorse his discredited economic policies. But Hoover had lost all credibility. What remained of the banking system virtually collapsed in January and February of 1933. There were about 25,000 banks in the U.S. at the onset of the Depression. Many were small institutions with limited assets and couldn't survive the downturn without an infusion of cash from the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department. About 5,000 small banks failed before the 1932 election, and another 5,500 went under by March 1933. Since deposits were not insured and ordinary Americans had no idea which banks to trust, early in 1933, small savers rushed to withdraw billions of dollars from their accounts. This escalating panic threatened to bring down even large, well-managed banks. When Hoover refused to intervene, most state governors imposed bank holidays. They ordered banks to shut their doors to prevent mass withdrawals and inevitable collapse. By March 4th, 32 states had suspended all banking activity, and the economy was paralyzed. Hoover's outgoing Secretary of the Treasury, Ogden Mills, told a banker friend planning a trip to the Bahamas, "Don't buy a round-trip ticket. When you return, there will be nothing worth returning to." Like most of his advisors, Roosevelt came of age in the Progressive Era and saw government as a positive force to mitigate the excesses and inequalities of the new industrial order. He believed the government could help preserve individual liberty and enhance opportunity. But New Dealers often disagreed among themselves on details of policy. Some favored balanced budgets, while others insisted that running deficits promoted growth. Some advocated central economic planning, others retained faith in free markets. One group of New Dealers urged redistributing wealth to those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, while others insisted that government could help the poor most effectively by promoting overall growth. New Dealers generally sympathized with the efforts of workers to organize unions, but hesitated to intervene on their behalf. Most New Dealers agreed that underconsumption by poorly paid workers and farmers, along with selfish actions by financial institutions, had caused the Depression. Recovery would require active federal regulation of capital markets, assistance to farmers and businesses, and increased government spending to boost production and consumption.
It is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it, if that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. We start from the bottom, that the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on. We say to America, 125 million, none shall be too big, none shall be too poor, none shall work too much, none shall be idle. No luxurious mansions empty, none walking the streets, none impoverished, none in pestilence, none in want, but in the land blessed by the smile of the Creator, with everything to be consumed, to be eaten, to be worn, that America will become a land sharing the fruits of the land, not for the favored few, not to satisfy greed, but that all may live in a land in which the Lord has provided an abundance sufficient for the luxury and convenience of the people in general, I think.
Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion rejected by the hearts and minds of men. True, they have tried, but their efforts have been cast in the pattern of an outworn tradition. Faced by failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profit.
Moments after taking the presidential oath, FDR invoked emergency powers to issue a proclamation closing all national banks effective Monday, March 6th. He then called Congress into a special session on March 9th. In less than a day, the president persuaded Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This created a system to audit, loan funds to, and reopen banks under Treasury Department supervision. On the evening of March 12th, Roosevelt explained the procedure to an anxious public in a 14-minute radio address, the first of 36 fireside chats he delivered on policy issues over the next 12 years. Half of all American adults listened to the president as his aristocratic and reassuring voice described the causes of the banking crisis, the procedures to audit and reopen sound banks, and how regulators would safeguard future deposits. In June, Congress enacted the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which established strict guidelines for banking operations and expanded the power of the Federal Reserve System. The law closed many small banks and forced several thousand others to merge with larger, more stable institutions. It also separated risky commercial and investment banking from ordinary banking, a firewall that lasted until 1999. The new Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, helped restore faith in banks by guaranteeing individual deposits for up to $5,000, an amount raised gradually over time. The new administration also moved quickly to prevent the kind of wild speculation that led to stock market booms and busts. The Securities Act of 1933 required companies selling stock to the public to register with a federal agency and provide accurate information on what was being sold. The subsequent Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created a Securities Exchange Commission, otherwise known as SEC, which has nothing to do with college football, to regulate stock markets and activities by brokers. As with banking reform, this left the basic operation of capital markets in private hands, but imposed rules and supervision over market operations. Between March and June, often dubbed the first 100 days, Roosevelt prevailed on Congress to pass 14 major pieces of legislation, a record never duplicated and a testament to both presidential leadership and the country's desire for change. Congress enacted bills to raise agricultural prices, put the unemployed to work, regulate the stock market, reform banking practices, and assist homeowners and farmers in paying mortgages. Telling aides he felt it was a good time for a beer, Roosevelt convinced Congress to amend the Volstead Act to allow production of beer and wine, while the states went through the long process of ratifying the 21st Amendment that repealed the 18th Amendment mandating prohibition. Except for the Economy Act, which modestly cut the salaries of federal workers and veterans' pensions, all the new legislation expanded the size, scope, and spending of the federal government. This burst of energy fulfilled FDR's promise of bold, persistent experimentation. As journalist Walter Lippmann observed, in the 100 days, we became again an organized nation, confident of our power. To meet the challenge of youth unemployment, Congress created the Civilian Conservation Corps. Within a few months, it enrolled 275,000 men, mostly in their 20s, in 1,300 labor camps across the country. They received $30 per month, plus room and board, and had to send $22 home to their families. Because Army officials organized the initial CCC efforts, critics worried it might resemble the Hitler youth indoctrination camps established by the Nazis. But in fact, they had little in common and did not delve into politics. In 1935, at its peak, 500,000 men worked on CCC projects. By the time the program ended in 1942, about 3 million men had served. Besides good pay and wholesome meals, volunteers received literacy and vocational training. In addition to conservation work, the CCC constructed the infrastructure of the national park system. Other New Deal innovations included the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. FARA, headed by Harry Hopkins, began with a $500 million appropriation to provide matching funds to states to hire the unemployed to work on public projects. PWA, managed by Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, spent more than $3 billion in the first 3 years building large public works projects such as dams in the Pacific Northwest, highways, and public buildings. TVA represented a vast experiment in regional planning. It built a network of dams and hydroelectric projects to control floods, generate power, and promote growth in chronically poor areas of the South. Cheap electricity generated by TVA dramatically improved life for millions of Southerners, and it still plays a major role in the region. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Administration, famous for its Blue Eagle logo. The NRA resembled World War I programs that brought together industry leaders and labor groups to boost production. NRA wrote production codes for each industry that encouraged cooperation among competing businesses to set stable prices and wages and bar cutthroat competition. Roosevelt hoped these measures would stabilize the economy and prompt private business to hire more workers, but neither occurred, and the NRA failed to address the biggest impediment to recovery, which was the lack of new private investment funds and the large pool of unemployed workers who lacked the money to buy goods. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared NRA an unconstitutional overreach of federal authority, and it came to an end. Despite NRA's defeat, the New Deal writ large addressed both immediate problems and long-term needs. In an economy dominated by powerful business interests, New Dealers hoped to mitigate concentrated corporate power by creating what economists called countervailing powers. For example, industrial labor unions could balance the influence of big business and promote workers' welfare. Electric power generated by government-built dams in the Tennessee Valley and Pacific Northwest and distributed by consumer-owned cooperatives would compete with private utilities and pressure them to improve service and reduce rates. New agencies to regulate banking and the stock market would empower private investors to take informed risks and small depositors to put their money in banks where it could be loaned out to promote economic expansion. Government-administered pensions funded by workers' and employers' contributions would provide the elderly a decent retirement and make them less dependent on the whims of their employers. Agricultural subsidies to farmers would provide a cash flow that made them less vulnerable to market blips or the power of large food processors. Roosevelt once told Labor Secretary Francis Perkins, "We're going to make a country in which no one is left out." In a speech near the end of his life, he added that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. To achieve these ideals, The New Deal altered the relationship between government, business, and individual Americans.
The idea behind all of Roosevelt's New Deal is that people have talent. That you may be poor, you may be broke, you may be really down on your luck, but there's some talent in you. We need you, and we will pay you and we will help you if you kind of pitch in. And it was an inclusiveness to Roosevelt's policies that really psychologically started stirring people, at least to start moving out of the mire of the Great Depression.
But not all of FDR's employment schemes had champions. While building projects filled a clear need, the arts and white-collar jobs were a much tougher sell.
Under the Works program, artists, actors, writers, and musicians contribute their share to the cultural development of the community.
Funding the arts was not automatic. When the government seemed to drag its feet, a group of unemployed writers in New York took action. They formed picket lines and marched with placards demanding work projects.
Someone handed us leaflets. Unemployed, unite. Fight for jobs. Fight together. As I read, I heard drums. Men and women carried placards. We want jobs. Jobs, not charity. And like one in a trance, I fell into step.
Despite the New Deal's early political victories, many liberals feared that in the face of conservative opposition, Roosevelt had abandoned plans to restructure the economy or redistribute wealth. But on June 28, 1934, in a fireside chat, he renewed his promise to promote additional social insurance measures to improve living standards for ordinary people. Roosevelt warned that Republicans and others would attack his initiatives, labeling them as, quote, fascism or communism or socialism. Roosevelt then began an extended sea voyage, traveling through the Panama Canal and visiting several Latin American capitals to highlight his good neighbor policy that treated hemispheric neighbors as equals. After a stop in Hawaii, he sailed back to the Pacific Northwest. From there, he traveled by train back to the East Coast, making side trips to visit many big federal construction projects underway, such as the dams being built along the Columbia and Missouri rivers. These massive public works, FDR asserted, would provide millions of American households and businesses with inexpensive and reliable electricity, control floods, and relieve droughts. The Resettlement Administration supervised rural relief activities. Its head, Rexford Tugwell, a member of the original Brain Trust, pushed for assistance to tenant farmers and sharecroppers, groups ignored by earlier farm aid programs. But opposition by rural Democrats and Republicans who opposed social engineering in the countryside limited RA efforts to construction of only 3 of a proposed 60 planned suburban towns, and the 3 made were Greenbelt, Maryland, Green Hills, Ohio, and Greendale, Wisconsin. Only about 5,000 poor farm families were placed on better land. In 1937, the Farm Security Administration replaced the RA. The new agency assisted about 20,000 tenant farmers to purchase their own land. It also constructed model housing camps for migratory farm workers. Many of the most famous photographs from the Depression era were taken by FSA photographers such as Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, and Gordon Parks. Lange's portraits of struggling families became cultural icons representing the suffering of millions. The Rural Electrification Administration benefited millions of Americans. 90% of farms had no electricity in 1935. REA loaned money to locally owned nonprofit cooperatives to build rural power grids. Within 5 years, nearly half of all farms had electric power, and by 1950, 90% were on the power grid. This advance created huge demand for home appliances and new farm equipment, one of the reasons REA and its offspring continued to enjoy support for decades. In 1935, FDR tasked Harry Hopkins to manage the largest of the new programs, the Works Progress Administration. Hopkins believed that work relief would prevent social unrest by giving the unemployed meaningful labor. The tools and raw materials used on WPA projects, along with the wages paid, would also stimulate the private economy. As an additional impetus to long-term growth, the projects would produce vital infrastructure such as roads, bridges, libraries, airports, and schools. Most WPA workers were hired locally. Administrative costs consumed just 4% of the budget, with 90% paid as wages. Hopkins had a vision of inclusiveness. WPA reached out not only to laborers, but to artists, sculptors, musicians, playwrights, novelists, dancers, and actors as well. Between 1935 and 1942, about 8.5 million Americans worked for the WPA at some point. In 1935, the Roosevelt administration proposed a national plan for unemployment and disability insurance, aid to dependent children, and pensions for the elderly. Only 1 in 7 private sector workers had any sort of pension. Most workers kept their jobs as long as they were physically able, and then drew on savings or assistance from relatives. The president assigned Labor Secretary Frances Perkins to supervise drafting the Social Security Act. Like her boss, Perkins rejected calls for direct federal pensions paid out of general tax revenues. Instead, she proposed a government-administered system funded primarily by contributions, such as payroll taxes, from workers and employers, not general tax revenues. In this sense, it represented an insurance program more than a welfare program. The proposed act encountered fierce opposition from business owners, commercial farmers, and doctors, some of whom simply disliked paying taxes, while others denounced any government involvement in worker-employee relations. Many Republican politicians worried that those receiving pensions would all become loyal Democrats. Many business owners disliked having to contribute toward employee pensions. The American Medical Association complained so loudly about, quote, socialized medicine, that the administration dropped plans to include a modest national health insurance plan within Social Security. To placate commercial farmers and wealthier Americans, the law exempted most agricultural and household domestic laborers. Many government workers, teachers, waitresses, and employees of nonprofit agencies were also denied coverage. These exemptions had the perverse effect of excluding from coverage 1/2 of all African American and women workers. The proposal, as passed in 1935, included provisions to assist laid-off and injured workers, surviving dependents of dead workers, and single mothers with young children. Over time, many more workers were covered by the law, and payments rose from their meager early levels. Popular culture during the 1930s built on trends established in the previous decade. Newspapers, magazines, and especially the radio and movies informed and entertained the public. Inexpensive radio receivers were nearly ubiquitous, helped by New Deal construction of rural electric grids. With the arrival of sound and color, movies became an even more popular escape. Americans traveled less abroad, but streamed into national parks, many of which had cabins and campsites built by the CCC. Trains still carried most long-distance travelers, but flying became more common with the introduction of the first modern passenger plane, the DC-3, in 1937. By 1939, the nation's young airlines had flown 3 million passengers. During the first half of the 1930s, fear of violence gripped the nation. Although overall crime rates did not rise during the Depression, high-profile criminals, especially bank robbers, dominated newspaper headlines. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, and Ma Barker gained celebrity status. Some gangsters achieved a kind of Robin Hood aura when they gave away some of the money they robbed from banks. At the same time, the public sought reassurance that the forces of law and order would ultimately prevail. Roosevelt sensed that fighting a successful war on crime would enhance public faith in the New Deal's battle against economic hardship. He and Attorney General Homer S. Cummings designated J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Justice Department's Small Bureau of Investigation, to lead the campaign.
about you today, lawyer.
You did? What?
You're going to be a big G-man.
That's right.
You ought to be dumped in a ditch, stool pigeon. Remember to keep your tin badge in Washington. If you come around here sticking your puss in our affairs, you'll get a belly full of this. Now beat it.
Between 60 and 70 million movie tickets were sold each week, and crime films proved exceedingly popular. Many of the more than 50 gangster movies released in the years 1931 and 32, such as Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, and Scarface, which was Al Capone's favorite, resembled Horatio Alger's stories in reverse. They depicted ruthless and violent men who gained wealth and power by breaking the law. But in 1934, Hoover's so-called G-men killed Dillinger and Nelson. Under government pressure, Hollywood studios adopted a production code that barred the sympathetic portrayal of gangsters. G-Men, released in 1935, followed by 6 FBI-centered films in 1936, featured Hoover's agents as symbols of righteous justice who always got their man. With a boost from Hollywood, the illusory crime wave ended, and Hoover secured his job as FBI director for the next 40 years. Musicals such as 42nd Street and Babes in Arms also found large audiences among a nation that savored an escape from hard times. Debonair dancers Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers charmed movie audiences in films like Top Hat, Flying Down to Rio, The Gay Divorcee, and Swing Time. Comedy films starring the Marx Brothers, the Ritz Brothers, and W.C. Fields, along with cartoons produced by the Disney and Warner Brothers studios, also entertained filmgoers. Child star Shirley Temple, born in 1928, proved the biggest box office draw of the decade. Her dimpled cheeks, curly hair, and spunky innocence drew millions of adoring viewers, old and young, into theaters to watch films such as The Littlest Rebel and Curly Top. Sometimes the plots of these films acknowledged the country's hard times, but their plucky stars had an uncanny ability to triumph over adversity. Americans spent much of their leisure time listening to the radio. Daytime melodramas, called soap operas because of their sponsorship, appealed to women working at home. Late afternoon programs targeted school-age children. Dinnertime broadcasts provided highlights of the day's news, and evening shows played big band music and original comedy and drama. Broadcasts of baseball games were also very popular. The New York Yankees, with their colorful roster, including Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, seemed almost like a national team. Two of the era's most popular radio shows had ethnic themes. Amos and Andy, a comedy in which white actors depicted two gullible African Americans scheming to strike it rich, was immensely popular. Nearly as many Americans tuned in several times a week to follow The Goldbergs, a comedy drama set in a Bronx, New York tenement. Actress Gertrude Berg played Molly Goldberg, the matriarch of a Jewish family, whose signature line was to lean out of her apartment window and call out, "Yoo-hoo!" to neighbors with whom she gossiped. Berg, who pollsters reported was the woman most admired by Americans after Eleanor Roosevelt, wrote most of the scripts and included poignant references to anti-Semitism in the U.S. and to the looming Nazi threat to European Jews. Radio sometimes provided a more serious form for African Americans than the patronizing parodies of Amos and Andy. Beginning in 1938 and continuing until 1947, more than 100 CBS radio stations broadcast the weekly performance of a gospel choir group called Wings Over Jordan. Between songs, the show aired interviews with black scholars, educators, and politicians, such as Mary McLeod Bethune, Langston Hughes, and Congressman Adam Clayton Powell.
The March of Time!
In this pre-television age, theater owners showed newsreels as well as cartoons before or between feature films. The March of Time, beginning in 1934, contained vivid footage of current events, natural disasters, and celebrity sightings. It also presented to a national audience highlights from popular sporting events such as college football, baseball, and boxing, as well as current fads such as week-long roller derbies and marathon dance contests. Newspapers remained the predominant form of journalism during the 1930s, but they faced great competition from magazines. Reader's Digest became the most widely circulated periodical in the nation by 1938. News weeklies such as Time and Newsweek gained large readerships, and Life magazine won acclaim for its stunning photography. In 1934, the Treasury Department funded a one-year public works of arts project that employed nearly 4,000 painters and sculptors who produced more than 15,000 works of art displayed in public buildings. This became a model for the much larger federal arts, music, dance, theater, and writers' projects, all WPA programs created in 1935. The WPA employed thousands of struggling artists to paint murals in public buildings and teach art classes in public schools. 38 symphony orchestras performed free concerts nationwide. The Dance Project hired classical and modern ballet dancers to perform around the country. The Writers Project employed 10,000 people who traveled around the country recording regional music and folk stories, writing local histories and travel guides, and interviewing former slaves for a massive oral history project. They also provoked a backlash when conservative Democrats and Republicans in Congress gained influence during 1939. They denounced these arts programs as left-wing propaganda and cut off funds for the Federal Theater and other cultural projects. Early in 1937, Congress convened with huge Democratic majorities, 331 to 89 in the House and 76 to 16 in the Senate. The New Deal seemed poised for another burst of social activism. But by the end of 1938, hope for bold economic and social initiatives had faded. Roosevelt lost a fight to reorganize the Supreme Court, presided over a steep economic downturn, and failed in a bid to purge conservative Democrats from Congress. Once the worst of the Depression crisis had abated, national politics reverted to its more conservative tradition. Southern Democrats, who feared that liberal New Dealers would promote racial reform, frequently joined forces with Northern Republicans, who opposed additional economic regulation, ultimately to block expansion of the welfare state. After 1938, this coalition, along with the gathering clouds of war in Europe and Asia, frustrated efforts by New Dealers to build on their previous accomplishments. Between 1934 and 1936, a 5-vote conservative majority on the 9-member Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional key pieces of New Deal legislation, including the NRA and AAA. The conservatives ruled that the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution granted Congress and the President very limited power to regulate the economy. It barred, they maintained, most federal efforts to set wage levels or regulate business. Under this doctrine, not only were congressional powers limited, but some of their rulings even questioned the long-held precedent that allowed state governments to regulate business within their own borders. Roosevelt complained that the Supreme Court's actions had created a no-man's land where no government, state or federal, can function or impose any meaningful regulation on business behavior or other aspects of the economy. With the court poised in 1937 to strike down such New Deal pillars as the Social Security and National Labor Relations Act, the president and his supporters expressed growing frustration. Several of the most conservative Supreme Court justices were elderly men appointed decades earlier who saw themselves as guardians of property rights threatened by a president they hated. Roosevelt reciprocated their feelings and in 1937 proposed the Judiciary Reorganization Act. He asked Congress to ease the burden on elderly jurists, really to dilute the conservative bloc, by allowing him to appoint additional justices for each member of the High Court over the age of 70. The Constitution allowed Congress to adjust the size of the Supreme Court, and it had done so several times, but the number had settled at 9 after the Civil War and had taken on an aura of inviolability. Roosevelt tried to push this change through Congress without much consultation, alienating members of both parties who complained about what they called the, quote, court packing scheme, end quote. Their opposition forced the president to drop the plan at a substantial cost to his reputation. Despite this failure, however, the Supreme Court soon swung around to support the New Deal. One conservative justice switched sides, joining the four liberals in voting to sustain key laws. Over the next few years, the other conservative justices retired. By 1944, Roosevelt had the opportunity to appoint a total of 8 Supreme Court justices, including Felix Frankfurter, Wiley Rutledge, Frank Murphy, Hugo Black, William O. Douglas, Stanley F. Reed, Robert H. Jackson, and James F. Burns. This new majority supported the president's belief that the Constitution gave the federal government broad authority to regulate business, the economy, labor conditions, and the environment. In a series of rulings, the Supreme Court upheld minimum wage laws, workplace regulations, production limits on farmers, Social Security, and the government's rights to require that businesses recognize labor unions. During the 1940s and early 1950s, several of these justices joined in landmark civil rights decisions that began dismantling the framework of racial segregation enshrined since the 1890s. Just as the judicial uncertainty hovering over the New Deal disappeared, new economic and political constraints stifled efforts at greater reform. Midway through 1937, a severe recession shook confidence in Roosevelt's leadership and prompted a conservative resurgence. The economy had grown rapidly between 1933 and 1937. Although many workers still sought jobs, the rate of unemployment had declined from 25% to about 14%. Roosevelt and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau considered this drop evidence that the economic emergency had passed and the time had come to restore the principle of a balanced budget. At their urging, Congress reduced federal spending by about 10% in 1937 and 38, eliminating funding for many WPA-related jobs programs. At the same time, employed workers began paying the new Social Security tax, which pulled about $2 billion out of circulation. The Federal Reserve further stressed the economy by tightening credit rules for the nation's banks, an action that made loans more expensive. This combination of spending cuts, tax hikes, and more costly credit sharply reduced consumer purchasing power and pushed the still fragile economy into a steep decline. 5 years of steady stock price increases reversed and unemployment surged. Conservative economic advisors urged Roosevelt to make further cuts to balance the budget. New Deal liberals argued in favor of increased federal spending to stimulate economic growth. Evidence in favor of additional deficit spending was provided by British economist John Maynard Keynes, who in 1936 published his landmark book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes, whose ideas had circulated for several years, argued that deficit spending should be used as a normal tool to stimulate sluggish economic growth by boosting mass purchasing power. When private investment and orders for goods declined, Keynes asserted, the government should engage in compensatory or counter-cyclical spending to, quote, prime the economic pump, end quote. This could take the form of building a playground, a post office, a dam, or a battleship. New orders for concrete and steel would boost output by heavy industry, while at the end of the chain, construction workers with money in their pockets would buy food, pay rent, and purchase clothes. Once recovery began, government could reduce its role, collect additional taxes, and restore a balanced budget. Keynes and his American disciples considered the events of 1937 as proof that the private economy had only partially recovered from the trauma of the Depression and still required a big federal stimulus. Roosevelt dithered for months before taking action. In the spring of 1938, he accepted the argument made by Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes to abandon his quest for an early balanced budget. He persuaded Congress to fund a $5 billion spending program to resume hiring the unemployed and increase mass purchasing power. This new spending, along with military orders placed in American factories from Great Britain and France in response to the German threat in Europe, restored economic growth. In June 1938, Roosevelt won congressional approval for what turned out to be the last major New Deal reform before World War II, the Fair Labor Standards Act. The law banned child labor, established a federal minimum wage starting at 40 cents per hour, and set the standard work week at 40 hours. But to secure the votes of Southern Democrats, Roosevelt agreed once again to exempt from coverage most agricultural and domestic workers, whose ranks included a high proportion of women, blacks, and Hispanics.
Like millions of young African Americans, Richard Wright migrated to Chicago, hoping for work and a better life. Wright came from Mississippi with just 7 years of education. Still, he landed a post office job and managed to support his mother and younger brother in a tiny apartment. Then suddenly, he lost his job.
Some folks in the world love our bread of brown. Oh, Lord, you wouldn't have go and leave your home.
One morning, my mother told me there was no food for breakfast. I knew that the city had opened relief stations, so I put on my hat and coat and went out. I rode in zero weather for miles in open trucks, then spaded the frozen earth for 8 hours, only to ride home again in the dark. A strange emotional peace had come to me. I knew that my life was cast with the men with whom I worked. Slow, plodding, inarticulate men. Workers all.
He had come expecting things to be better. And just a few years after he gets there in 27, the Depression hits. So that's a slap in the face for somebody who is thinking that I've now escaped the South, I've escaped the racist terror of the South, I'm now going north, life will be much better. And in fact, it gets much worse.
I went to the crossroads, fell down on my knees. I went to the crossroads, fell down on my knees. At the Lord above, I'm mercy now. Say, poor Bob, if you please. He stands at the crossroads, try to flag a ride. I tried to flag a ride. Did nobody seem to know me, babe? Everybody passed me by. Stand at the crossroads, baby, ride the sun going down. Stand at the crossroads, baby, ride the sun going down. I believe to my soul now, oh, Bob is backing down. And I went to the crossroads, mama, I looked east and west. I went to the crossroads, baby, I looked east and west. Lord, I didn't have no sweet woman, baby, in my despair.